Shalom Avracha. This evening we are privileged to study together the Haftarah of Parshat Vayeitzei. And although there are different customs, our custom is to read from chapters 12, 13, and 14 of the book of Hosea. The prophet Hosea, the first of the 12 prophets in the book of Torah. Our Haftarah begins with a description of the activities of Yaakov, and this description parallels the teachings of the Parshat, almost verbatim. The Parshat begins, Vayeitzei, about Yaakov leaving Eretz Yisroel, leaving Beersheba, and going to Haran, as does the Haftarah. I'm reading from chapter 12, verse 13 of Hosea. Vayivrach Yaakov Sdei Aram, and Yaakov, Jacob, fled to the fields of Aram. Vayavod Yisrael Be'isha, and Yisrael, that's a name which I hope to be speaking about shortly. Yisrael, Jacob, worked, as you remember the story in the Torah section of this week of Vayeitzei, he was working so diligently for so many years for his wife, to be able to receive his wife Rachel, and then when there was some kind of change, he worked an additional years for the privilege of getting together with his beloved wife, and then he worked beyond that. And the Torah describes at length in Parshat Vayeitzei all about the efforts of the activities of the labor of Yaakov. Anyone who studies Parshat Vayeitzei, it's a central theme in the Parshat. In the Haftarah, the parallelism, as we've spoken several times, very often the rabbis looked for a teaching in the prophets which parallels the teaching in the Chumash. So Yaakov fled, as it says here in the Haftarah, Jacob fled to the fields of Aram. Yisroel worked for a wife and guarded the sheep for the purpose of receiving these special levels of consideration. I was intrigued when I studied this sentence by one of the words in this verbiage. In this state of expression, Hosea uses an expression which seemed to me to be unusual, because it says that Yaakov fled to the fields of Aram, Vayivrach Yaakov Sdei Aram, and suddenly he uses, instead of the word Jacob, he uses the word Israel. Vayavod Yisrael Be'isha. Yisrael worked for the sake of receiving a wife. Remember the arrangement he made with Lavan, the 7 years, an additional 7 years for first for Rachel, which turned out to be Leah, and then Rachel. What do you mean Yisrael worked for an Isha? He wasn't called Yisrael at that point. Yisrael's a later stage. Israel's a later stage in the name of this person. So I looked at the commentary. Why does Hosea use the term Yaakov runs away from Israel, and Yisrael works in the house of Lavan? It seems that Yisrael is not the name. We don't find anywhere in the entire Parshat Vayeitzei that he's called Yisrael. It's only later in the encounter with the wrestling encounter with an angelic force. And God changed his name. The angel changed. Where is Yisrael? I saw several approaches. You could say it's stylistic, if you'd like. You could say that in order to make the sentence more readable. So he starts off by calling the main character Yaakov, and since Yaakov and Yisrael are almost interchangeable, so he uses the word Yisrael, and I think that's a fair explanation. I saw in Dat Mikra, maybe Yisrael, eventually he became Yisrael, but it doesn't seem to me to fit the word. Vayavod Yisrael Be'isha. Yisrael was working there. And therefore, with your permission, I'd like to suggest the following. I would like to say that in the labors of Jacob, in the land of Aram, in the fields of Aram, in the house of his father-in-law, he was demonstrating not only the level of Jacob, but he really was demonstrating and living the example of the life of Israel, the life of Yisrael, the elevated level. Because one of the main lessons that we learn, one of the great teachings that we have in our Torah section is we learn of the dedicated efforts and energies of Yaakov in the house of Lavan under the most difficult of conditions. So much so that when Rambam, Maimonides in his code, when in the Maimonidean code he wants to give an example of how someone is supposed to work. If you're an employee, how are you supposed to work for someone else? There are some people who feel that maybe a worker, if you're a religious worker, so what does that mean? It means that, I don't know, that you observe Shabbat, you leave early enough for Shabbat, or maybe it means that you take along, kosher or glad kosher snacks and meals, or maybe you wear certain kinds of head coverings or certain kinds of clothes. That's all true. But I believe that a truly religious employee follows in the pathway of Yisroel. Vayavod Yisroel Beisha. He's teaching us what it means to really work. I'd like to quote Rambam's teaching on how you're supposed to work for someone. And this is in the Rambam's code in Mishneh Torah. If you're interested, chapter 13, halacha 17, Perik Yud Gimel, halacha Yud Zayin of Hilchot Schirut. Says the Rambam, Hayav hapoel la'avod b'chol kocho. A laborer is supposed to put his or her entire self into the work that they're doing. And what's his proof? What sentence does he quote from the Torah? Our father Yaakov. Shaharei Yaakov HaTzadik. For our righteous father, Yaakov. Amar ki b'chol kochi. Ki b'chol kochi avadati et avichem. I put everything I had into working. When Yaakov is about to take leave of his father, and he calls together his wives and he says, I want you to know I tried so hard. I gave everything. I gave my whole being to working here. Says the Rambam, this is not merely the activities of Yaakov, but Yaakov is teaching us a model. I would like to suggest that perhaps the prophet is using this word Yisrael because Yaakov, through this elevated level, is in a certain sense already reaching this level of Yisrael, the higher level of the service of God. Says the Rambam, therefore he receives reward not only in the world to come for this, but every student of our Parshat remembers that the Torah describes the great wealth that was amassed by Jacob. Says the Rambam, where did he get, upon which activity? Which activity allowed him the merit of the reward of this great wealth? It says in the last sentence of chapter 30, Vayifrot sa'ish ma'od ma'od, the man became exceedingly wealthy. Vayilot tzon and rabot ushfachot vavadim ugmalim vachamorim, tremendous livestock. From where? Says the Rambam, because he was so dedicated as a worker in the house of his father-in-law. And I believe that's what Hosea is speaking about here. Vayavod Yisrael b'isha. And if you read in chapter 31 of Genesis, you read the way Yaakov describes his tenure of stay in the house of Lavan. He says as follows. I'm reading from sentence 38. I've been working here for 20 years. Ze esrim shana anochi imach. For 20 years I've been working here. And I saw to it to take care of all of your animals. The sheep, the goats. They were so well taken care of. They never lost their offspring. There were no miscarriages amongst the animals. I didn't even take anything for myself. I didn't take anything for myself. I didn't take my own food. I didn't eat any of your animals. I didn't consume any of the animals. Even though I could have said I'm in charge and I can do what I want. No. I didn't take advantage of the fact that I was the shepherd. Beautiful words. If an animal was torn apart, was attacked by some fierce animal, I took responsibility. Says Yaakov. I replaced it. I took personal responsibility for anything that was happening with the herds. Genufti yom, genufti laila, anything which was taken during the day or by night, a whole day and a whole night, I was responsible. And then he describes the work conditions. Sentence 40, Hayiti vayom. When I was working during the day, it was so hot. It was blazingly hot. Hayiti vayom achalani chorev. Chorev is burning hot. So many people would say, listen, how much do you want me to do? I can't work. I can't work under such conditions. But if you're a student of Yaakov, if you understand that Yaakov now is reaching the level of Yisroel, maybe Yisrael is not a one-time activity that then he becomes Yisrael. Maybe Hosea is saying already in the earliest stages, and that's the chidush I would like to suggest, that already at this point he's already becoming Yisrael. Because who works like this? Achalani chorev. Achalani chorev. I couldn't bear the heat. And then he says at night. So some people, you take off at night, right? How much can you work? Can you work 24 hours a day? He says it was freezing outside at night. V'kerach malayla. V'kerach malayla. It was freezing conditions. So go inside, go into the blankets. Okay, whatever will happen with the animals will happen. Whatever will happen with the sheep. No, I was working for Lavan. Vayavod Yisrael bi'isha u'bi'isha shamar. Shamar, he was so carefully protecting the livestock. And then he says, Vatidad shenati me'inai. And I lost so much sleep as a result of this. There was no sleep on my eyes for the years that I was working. So I feel that maybe we're supposed to learn from the lessons of the model of Jacob how to behave, each of us in his or her own way. I don't want to say anything negative, but there are people, God forbid, who work in offices all over the world. I'm sure it's already been perfected way before we speak about this, but in the past, there have been people who find justification for using the goods and the services of the offices that they work in. They speak on the phone, more than perhaps is allowed in their contracts. Maybe they use the fax machines and the internet and the Xeroxes, maybe in ways which are problematic, maybe in ways which negate the spirit of our teacher, Yisroel b'isha. Maybe there are people, I remember once visiting someone, I'm sure the person has repented many times since, so of course I hope nobody can identify the person I'm speaking about. I once went to visit someone in a different country, and I walked into this person's house. They had a whole drawer of materials that said on it, property of the Board of Education of that particular city. I don't want to mention the city; it's a great city, and I deeply respect that city. And he saw I was looking, so he started to say, well, his wages really, they don't get paid enough, and so he can take home some supplies, some erasers, some pencils, some pens. That's the opposite of Jacob. That's the opposite of Yisrael. That's the opposite of our teacher. You can't do that. I once met a certain person who told me that his job was to do. He was working in a certain summer camp somewhere. And his job was to take the camp's laundry and go to the local laundromat and do the laundry. And they paid him a certain salary. I don't know, a few $100s for the summer. But since it's a laundromat, you have to keep putting in quarters. They don't know how long the machines take, the washing machines, the dryers especially. So they would give him a certain amount of money every week. He would come back and bring back the camp's laundry. And he told me once, it was a class before Yom Kippur, I think. He said, well, I want to tell you that in the course of the summer, each week I would take a certain additional sum of money because I felt I deserved much more. I deserved much more for the services that I was rendering. I said to him, you have a right to ask for any amount of money you want. You can ask for any salary you want. But you have no right to illegitimately steal money from your employees. He said, what do you mean steal money? He says, do you know how hot it is in a laundromat, in the middle of July? I said, did you ever read the story about Jacob? Did you ever read about Vayavod Yisrael b'isha? And this great man, may he be blessed wherever he is, you know what he did? He found someone to get a bank check for him, and he calculated how much money he had taken from that summer camp, and he returned it. He's a student of our father. He's a student of our father Yaakov. Vayivrach Yaakov sdei Aram, when he ran away, he was on the level of Yaakov as he worked in his father-in-law's house. He demonstrated that he's not only Yaakov, but he's also Yisrael. May we all, in our own ways, try to reach at least a little bit of that level of Yisrael in all of our endeavors. Vayavod Yisrael, in the sense of Hosea's teaching. Thank you so much for listening. Shalom.
Peace.